Okay, guys, moving on to chapter 14. This will also be a relatively short lecture, and as I've mentioned already in my emails and as I announced in class, you don't have to read chapter 14 for purposes of our exams. Um, you can get whatever you need to know from this lecture, and I won't ask you any questions on the exams unless I've covered them in this lecture. And again, just to remind you, I think it would be a good idea for you to print the lecture off as you're watching, so that as you're watching the video, you can kind of make notes or whatever. Um, and the PowerPoint is posted to our Canvas site. Okay, so this lecture is about global communication, broadly speaking. And so, what is global communication or international communication? I actually teach a course on this topic. This semester, I've been teaching 465, which is global media systems. And some of you attended the presentations delivered by my students the other day. But global communication, international communication, is concerned with kind of communication across borders, how communication in one place is received by communication someplace else, right? So you have to understand that there's been an explosion in global communication. It used to be very difficult for governments, for instance, nations to communicate with one another, but because of the rise of technology, it's become much easier to communicate across great distances. So, international communication, global communication, it's really one of the fastest rising areas of study in our field. When people communicate across distance and time, it affects ideas, beliefs, economic, and political systems. This is one of kind of the important themes in the global communication literature. How how are people in Europe, for instance, affected by ideas that are communicated by Americans and through American media? Just to give you one example, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about this, or I'll talk a little bit more about this in this lesson. But that's kind of one of the important themes. How are people in other societies affected by what's communicated by us in our society, right? And vice versa. How are we affected by what they communicate? Um, it's interesting to note and important, most often communication is not used for sharing ideas, but it's used for promoting the economic and political interests of powerful nations. This is something that has been argued repeatedly in the literature. So you have dominant players in the global scene using their media apparatuses to influence other nations economically and politically. Okay, and I'll try to make this a little bit more clear. Specifically, one of the really important ideas that has emerged out of this area of literature, and I'll try to take a minute here to explain it, is this idea of cultural imperialism. So, what happens in the 20th century, obviously, if you go back throughout history and you look at different nations or empires, I mean, for as long as history has been recorded in the modern context, nations, empires, civilizations have battled with one another for positioning, and in some cases, dominance, right? They've vied for position with one another. And in the 20th century, kind of a new era was ushered in. You remember, in the 20th century, that's when a lot of these, it's when a lot of these colonization escapades, if you will, ended. So you had, the British Empire and the French Empire sort of occupying, vast quantities of land. And what happens in the 20th century, without going into a ton of history, but basically movements were established in these countries that were being occupied in Africa and Asia and the Middle East and in Central and South America. And people just said, you know, we don't want to be occupied. We don't want to be colonized anymore. And it became kind of taboo or sort of politically incorrect in a way. And a lot of these nations, a lot of movements within these nations successfully overthrew their colonizers, at least at one level or another. And we also had in the 20th century the rise of the global the global political umbrella groups, like in international relations. Like you have the United Nations established in the 20th century, in the middle of the 20th century, for instance, right? But what's also happening at this time is that some dominant players, like the United States, according to many scholars, were looking for other ways to maintain global dominance, global hegemony. You can't just go out and occupy people militarily, right? Set up your military and just occupy people. I mean, you can, it still happens, but it's not as common as it was. What happens now, according to people like Herbert Schiller, who was a famous sociologist who died recently, an American sociologist, he says that America, around the middle of the 20th century, started to export its culture to other societies, and that this gave the U.S. a type of soft power, not hard power, not military power. That's one thing, but that's different. But soft power is arguably more important because it's very insidious and because its effects can be very far reaching, according to scholars who work in this area. So Schiller presented this idea called cultural imperialism. So you know what imperialism, right? To dominate another country or another group or another society, to dominate them, usually militarily. Well, cultural imperialism is kind of sort of opposite of that in some ways. It's dominating another society or culture or nation, but doing it through culture. And what Schiller was saying is that Western culture, Western values were being exported to other societies, usually third world, underprivileged, still developing societies, right? And he said that these cultural products, and specifically American cultural products, because America became the only superpower in the world after World War II, he says that these ideas, these American ideas, as promoted by American media organizations, really established a type of global hegemony, a type of global dominance over other cultures. So what does this mean in practical terms, in case this is a little bit fuzzy? What it means is that, so for example, you're sitting off in Egypt, right, where I've had the chance to travel and live. And instead of Egyptian culture, as an Egyptian, what you're getting is American culture through McDonald's. So you go out to eat, you go to McDonald's, or you go to KFC, or you go to Pizza Hut, or you go to Domino's, or you go to Papa John's, or you go to TGI Fridays, or you go to Chili's, and on and on and on. You go to Baskin Robbins or Dairy Queen. And I'm naming restaurants that actually exist in Egypt in large numbers, right? That's where you go out to eat. You don't go to Egyptian restaurants. I mean, you do, but the American restaurants are kind of the status symbols. Um, when you watch TV, what do you watch? You watch Egyptian movies? Well, you might watch some Egyptian movies, and they do have a movie industry there, but you watch a lot more Hollywood movies, American movies. So you're getting American cultural ideas. When you go shopping, you're buying American clothing products. When you want to learn a language, when you want to go on the internet, you're going to learn English. And it's all kind of one way. It's from the United States to Egypt. It's not Egypt to the United States. When we Americans go out to the mall, we don't go to any Egyptian restaurants or, buy Egyptian clothes or watch Egyptian TV or Egyptian movies. I mean, we do that to some extent with some cultures, but for the most part, it's kind of one way. It's a one-way flow of information, according to many of the scholars that do research in this area. So that's kind of the implication, is that these local cultures in Egypt or in Chile or in China or wherever, they're kind of being um, sort of outstripped by Western culture, and specifically American culture, which has become really, really dominant in the cultural sphere. All kinds of ideas, American ideas, political ideas about democracy, economic ideas about capitalism, things, what you should wear, how you should dress, how you should eat, manners, mannerisms. These things are all kind of exported. And some people say it's not really a big deal, or it's not necessarily a harmful thing, but a lot of people are very critical because they say everything is just becoming the same and it's becoming Western. This kind of contributes to um, U.S. domination, and it exacerbates the gaps that already exist between the powerful and the less powerful, or the underprivileged, right? So, American corporations they're already wealthy and they get wealthier, right? And in some cases it can create kind of exploitative relationships. That's kind of the argument. Let's think about international news. For a period of time, international news was kind of, in some ways, off the radar. News bureaus, news budgets were slashed. Um, Americans were very interested in local news, but not as much in the global sphere. And it's very expensive for a newspaper or a television news outlet to have a foreign bureau. And so a lot of these were just kind of done away with. What happens, though, is that after 9/11, there's a resurgence in international news. So all of a sudden, Americans and American news organizations are very interested in what's happening globally, and vice versa. I mean, people overseas were interested in what was going on in the United States, right? So think about, for example, the implications of the photos of Abu Ghraib. They weren't just here in the United States, there were global implications because people all over the world were getting and seeing these images, and it affected U.S. policy. It kind of gave, at least for a period of time, it gave the U.S. Foreign policy, and specifically the war efforts in Iraq, kind of a black eye. Um, Think about CNN. CNN operates everywhere. There's CNN America and there's CNN International, which you don't see, but that's what's on, like, in the Middle East and in Europe. There's CNN Mexico. Think about Al Jazeera. They've also had so it's not always one way, right? I mean, Al Jazeera is an Arabic network, but they've extended into other cultures and other societies. So now people in America watch Al Jazeera. I mean, it's not as big as CNN, but there is now Al Jazeera America, which presents news in maybe a little bit of a different way. BBC, MTV, there are all these international networks now. If you go to any country in the world, you'll be able to watch, pretty much any country, you'll be able to watch MTV. And there are different MTV kind of like different divisions. So there's in the Arab region, there's actually something called MTV Arabiya, which means like Arabic MTV, where they show like the Arabic music videos. So, but that's an American product. I want to look briefly at libertarianism and authoritarianism because I think it's important to think about what the possibilities are for structuring, for structuring a media system and a political system. So libertarianism, we want to think about libertarianism and authoritarianism as a continuum. So think about one end of the continuum being libertarianism and the other end authoritarianism, right? So at one end we have libertarianism. And I want you to understand the differences. Libertarianism is a very liberal system. It's based upon high democratic ideals. The basic position of libertarians is that human beings are smart, they're rational, they're able to discern truth from falsehood. And so therefore, what we just need to do is give people information, allow them to discern truth from falsehood, and then we can kind of put things in their hands They should be able to rule themselves, essentially, right? Because they're smart enough to know who to elect in a democratic system. And so obviously you could probably guess that libertarians are very big on free speech. People should be able to say what they want to say, no matter what it is. Even if it is, even if people wanted to say, things that are arguably bad, like they wanted to say lies. That should be allowed because people will always be able to discern truth from falsehood because they're wise, they're rational, they're logical, right? And this is kind of the idea of the marketplace of ideas that underlies this notion. The marketplace of ideas says if truth and falsehood battle in the marketplace of ideas, in this imaginary marketplace, if they battle, the truth will always rise to the top. And the reason it will rise to the top is because the people that are listening to the debates will be able to discern truth from falsehood. Okay? So that's libertarianism. You might have guessed our system here in the United States is based on libertarian theory and libertarian ideals. We have for the most part, a democratic system, and we have for the most part, a free press. So our system here and most Western systems are based, at least loosely, on these libertarian principles. Now, we've talked about how we're not absolutely libertarian in this country. We've talked about just last week or the week before, we talked about some of the limitations to free speech in this society. An absolute libertarian, a pure libertarian, would say there should be no restrictions at all. Okay? One of the really important ideas that informs our understanding of libertarianism is the public sphere. The public sphere is a theory, a theoretical idea that was developed by a German philosopher named Habermas. Okay? And Habermas was basically kind of just theorizing and thinking about an ideal place. And he called this ideal place the public sphere. What is the public sphere? The public sphere is a social domain where private citizens can come together and discuss things and debate things of a political and social nature. Okay? People come together, private people, they come together at a place. It could be a coffee shop. And they engage in debate about political and social issues. That's a public sphere. And that is kind of the pinnacle for Habermas. He wants to create that domain in our modern societies. He wants to create that public space where we can just come together and debate. Because he believes that if we do that, he's a libertarian. He believes that if that happens, again, truth will rise to the top. He says that everyone's got to be invited for this to work. Everyone has to be invited to the public sphere. And the debate has to be open, and it has to be reasoned, has to be based on rational debate, rational argument. And if we do this, if we follow these simple rules, democratic truths will rise to the top. Let me say a little bit more about Habermas, just to give you a little bit more of kind of an idea of where he was coming from. Habermas was a big fan of 18th century European societies, specifically in in France and in the United Kingdom and in England at that time and in Germany. He says that there were public spheres established in those societies. And he cites some examples of public spheres. He actually mentions coffee shops. He says that these European individuals would go to these coffee shops, and it was a huge deal, these coffee shops in 18th century Europe, during the Enlightenment. And he says they would go to these coffee shops and they would just debate social and political issues. And he says that is the public sphere. And he also said another manifestation of the public sphere in these societies was the newspaper. Newspapers and newsletters at this time were really robust. They were really powerful. People were mentioning and talking and discussing and debating all kinds of ideas. And he says that was another manifestation of the public sphere. So these are really ideal places for Habermas. Some people have criticized Habermas because they said, wait a minute, 18th century Europe was not exactly the most welcoming place for everybody. They weren't debating everything. There were certainly no women in the public sphere. It was just a bunch of white guys, basically, and usually just the rich, elite white people. So people have criticized Habermas, but at least we can understand where he was coming from just theoretically. Like, he wants to create this space. And some people, it's interesting, when the internet exploded on the scene in the 1990s, public sphere theory got a huge boost because all these public sphere scholars came out and said, the internet, that is our public sphere. So think about that for a minute. You know, if we were in class, we would discuss this, but do you think the internet is a public sphere? Is it this equal space where people discuss and decide and they debate? Before you say yes, it is, think about the fact that everything's in English, or not everything, but a lot of things on the internet are in English, so that's just one language. Think about how that affects things. Think about how not everyone has access to the internet, and certainly not everyone has equal access. You and I have access, and we could have our own personal web pages, but we're not going to be as powerful as a corporation if they establish a website, right? So just think about some of those issues, and then think for yourself whether or not you think the internet represents a type of the public sphere. But the public sphere it kind of informs our understanding of libertarianism, which we just talked about, right? It's kind of a theory within the theory, if you want to think about it like that. So libertarianism and the public sphere, like I say here in this slide, the public sphere comes out of a libertarian ideal. Okay. Authoritarianism is pretty much the exact opposite of libertarianism. It says people aren't smart, they're not rational, they're basically stupid. There are just a few smart people in society, and they have to decide on our behalf. We shouldn't let people vote and engage in democratic activities because people are dumb. We should ask the wise people to make decisions on everyone's behalf. And that's why people call authoritarianism the theory of a few wise men, or the political system of a few wise men, because we just want a few wise men to make decisions on our behalf. That's what authoritarians would argue. And it follows that they don't believe that speech should be free. Authoritarians don't believe that speech should be free. They think that speech should be restricted because people won't be able to differentiate good information from bad information. So now I have to point out, when we think about libertarianism and authoritarianism, there are no societies on the face of the earth today that are 100% authoritarian or 100% libertarian. But there are sort of, dominant tendencies. We can say that the U.S., for instance, is closer to a libertarian system, right? It's not an authoritarian system. We could say that North Korea is closer to authoritarian. That's probably the best example of something that's really pretty close to an authoritarian system. And somebody might argue that it's really close to absolute authoritarianism. Although I would argue that there's at least a little bit of room to maneuver in North Korea, like with internet and stuff like that, where you can bypass certain government restrictions and do some things. So it's probably not absolutely authoritarian, but it's significantly authoritarian. Let's just say that. Now, there was a book written in the 1950s by Siebert Peterson and Schramm called Four Theories of the Press. And in this book, they presented four models of international communication. Libertarian, which we already talked about. They say the libertarian press, in a libertarian society, the press should be totally free. It's a marketplace of ideas. The truth will rise to the top. People are smart. They're rational. They're logical. So the press should be totally free. In an authoritarian system, it's exactly the opposite, as I just talked about. The press should be totally restricted by the few people that run the society, right? And then there are some things that are kind of in the middle. The Soviet theory is no longer relevant, really. This was not a perfect book. It was too limiting in a lot of ways. But The Soviet theory is closer to authoritarianism. And then there's something called social responsibility, which we've talked about. Remember when we talked about the Hutchins Commission? Social responsibility says that the press should be mostly free. So it's closer to what? Libertarianism. But social responsibility says there should be some restrictions on journalists, and that journalists and other members of the media should be responsible in their presentations of information. So they have to be accurate, they have to provide context, they have to provide depth and balance, educational value. They have to avoid sensationalism. That's what the Hutchins Commission argued for. Now, from one perspective, somebody might argue this is really good. This is just a little bit of a different take on libertarianism, but you're just saying the press need to be responsible. Somebody else might argue, though, and some have, that social responsibility is just a step toward authoritarianism. So some media scholars, like John Merrill, for example, a famous media scholar who just passed away a few years ago, he didn't like the social responsibility model because he said, when you start to play with these little restrictions and say, well, they have to provide context and they have to avoid sensationalism and so on and so forth, he's saying that that's just a move toward authoritarianism. So he thought he was just pretty much a pure libertarian. Okay, John Merrill was. I respectfully disagree. I happen to be closer to social responsibility. I happen to think the social responsibility model is the ideal model for a modern system, for a modern press system. You don't have to agree with me or him. You might have a different perspective, but I just wanted you to kind of understand kind of some of the differences between these different ideas, right? So let me just review, because there's a lot here. I know you could just rewind this, but so far we're talking about global communication, right? We talked a little bit about what that is, some of the implications of global communication, right? How ideas in one part of the world might affect societies on the other side of the world. And we talked a little bit about how this intersection between politics, economy, culture, media, there are some interesting implications. And most notably here, I talked about cultural imperialism, which is, I do want you to, for the purposes of the exam, I think you should understand what cultural imperialism is, what it means. That's, again, when one culture kind of dominates another culture, usually through media, right? We talked a little bit about international news and kind of the resurgence after 9/11 with that. And then we looked at some of these different models for international communication. And really, these are kind of political models. They're not just models of international communication or media, but they're models for political systems. And the point, guys, is that you've probably noticed this, but the political system and the media system are like tied at the hip. In other words, if you have a democratic political system, you will have a free press automatically. And if you have an authoritarian political system, you will have a restricted press system, an authoritarian press system. You can't have an authoritarian system with a free press. It just doesn't make sense. The press always reflects the larger political system. So we talked about libertarianism and what that is. We talked about public sphere as kind of a theory within that theory. And then we talked about authoritarianism, which is the opposite, right? And we looked a little bit at social responsibility again. We kind of reviewed that idea. Now, having said all of that, I want to talk about the digital divide. And this is a really important idea. I mentioned a moment ago, I talked about the internet, and when I was asking you to think about the public sphere, do you think the public sphere is a democratizing force? I should say, do you think the internet is a democratizing force? Do you think it represents that ideal space, that social domain that Habermas was talking about in his public sphere theory? Well, you have to think about the digital divide, because what happens is, as the internet becomes more and more indispensable to public life, I mean, think about us. We use the internet for everything. I mean, you wouldn't be able to watch this lecture right now if it wasn't for the internet. So as the internet becomes more and more indispensable and invaluable, those who lack access to the internet become further disadvantaged. And next week, they'll be even more disadvantaged, and next year they'll be even more disadvantaged. So the divide continuously grows. You understand? So there's this divide between people who have the internet and people who don't have the internet, and the divide continuously grows, right? So the formal definition of the digital divide, and this would be a good thing to know for your exam. It just makes a good test question. The digital divide is the gap that exists between individuals advantaged by the internet and those individuals relatively disadvantaged by their lack of internet access. Okay, and one of the things that gets exacerbated by the digital divide is what scholars call the knowledge gap, which is the gap in knowledge that exists and which is ever widened by new technologies. Whenever a new technology is diffused, whether telephone, radio, television, the internet, whatever, some people get the new technology and some people don't. The people that get it ultimately have more access to information than the people that don't get it, right? So there's a gap in knowledge that develops, and the gap in knowledge, like the digital divide, it keeps widening. It gets bigger and bigger and bigger, right? So this is why it's such a big issue in this society. The you know the situation with schools in the inner city, if they don't have access to the internet, or if the internet access is weak, if it's slow or whatever, then those kids are actually disadvantaged as compared to kids in suburban schools or whatever, right? So a knowledge gap is present, and it grows through the diffusion of technology. Again, we're talking about the technology haves and the technology have-nots. Okay, the haves and the have-nots. What feeds the digital divide and what feeds the knowledge gap? Well, the growth of the internet, driven by commercial forces. More and more people in certain societies get the internet, and other societies are continuously left in the dust. I mean, a majority of people in Egypt, for instance, where I was for 2.5 years, do not have regular access to the internet. And many of the people that do have regular access have really, really slow internet connections, right? So they're kind of being left behind. I mean, think about how many years have already elapsed, right? I mean, we've had internet here. I mean, I've had internet since the mid 90s. You've all grown up with the internet. It's been around since you were little kids. You were using the internet for different things. So there are huge implications, and that's, again, the growth of the internet. That's one of the things that feeds the digital divide. Most corporations have little interest in reaching lower income people because they'd rather cater to people who have more money to spend. Because remember, a big part of the internet is purchasing. It's buying. It's buying and selling, advertisements, online sales. That's a big part of internet growth now. So let me look at. Oops. Sorry. Let me just look at a couple of statistics here with you, and then we'll end this lecture. According to Pew in 2013, access to the internet and broadband was driven almost exclusively by income. So for instance, we think about the gaps being between like the US and poor countries in Africa, right? But there are gaps within our own society, as I kind of alluded to a minute ago when I talked about the inner city schools. But only 54% of US homes earning less than $20,000 per year have access to broadband internet. This is as of 2013. While 90% of US homes that earn more than $100,000 have access to broadband internet. So you see a huge gap between people who make not so much money and people that make a lot of money, or a relatively large amount of money. Also, only 70% of Americans that earn less than $20,000 a year have internet access, compared to 94% of those who earn more than $50,000. You can look up that Pew study from 2013. You can Google it and get a bunch more statistics if you want. Similar divides, by the way, are found when they look at education level and with regards to smartphone usage. So again, People that don't have high levels of education, people that don't make a lot of money, they tend to not have smartphones. People that make more money, that are more highly educated, they're more likely to have smartphones and use them. So these are some of the gaps that exist even within our own society. So I hope you've understood kind of the basic concepts. That's basically the gist of it for chapter 14. I'm not going to ask you anything on the exams for either exam 3 or the final. From chapter 14, like from the book, I'm only going to ask you about things that I presented in this lecture. So again, go over the slides, and if you have any questions about anything that I presented here, if there's anything that's not clear on libertarianism or the public sphere or authoritarianism or social responsibility or the digital divide or whatever, if there's anything that's not clear, drop me an email or stop by my office hours. Sorry, let me again figure out how to turn this off. Here we go.